Well, it seems strangely appropriate to begin the evening by saying, dear friends, as we gather. But it's lovely to see you all here for the next in our series of the Chelmsford Theological Society meetings through this year in 2014. Our overall title is Different Denominations, Distinctive Theologies. And tonight, it's wonderful that we have you here with us, Julia, speaking on behalf of the Society of Friends, the Quakers, and I'll introduce you properly in a moment. But I just wanted to remind you that there are more lectures, talks coming up in this series. Next month, so after Easter, on the 30th of April, we have someone here from Cambridge, Jonathan Hustler, and he's part of the Methodist tradition, and his title is the Wesleyan Theological Tradition. What is Evangelical Arminianism? Which will be very interesting. So the Methodists next time, at the end of April. I hope you've got that date noted or in your diary, and do hope you can be with us for that. Jonathan actually teaches in Cambridge, and I think will be an interesting speaker. Just to flag up as well that in May, following the thing we did last year, we're going to decamp down to East London, and we'll be at All Saints Church in Woodford Wells for a talk by John Mumford, who is actually, although he wouldn't quite like me putting him this way, he's the big chief when it comes to the vineyard, which is a fascinating part of the life of the church. So he's actually a very high-profile speaker, and All Saints Church Woodford Wells is part of the Vineyard Network, so that's why we go there, and also because it's very good for us Chelmsford focused people to go down to East London every now and again. Just to flag up, that's the 21st of May. But without any further ado, Julia, it's lovely to welcome you here to speak on behalf of the Society of Friends, and your title, as we can see from your first slide, Quaker Peacework from Past to Present. Thank you for being here. Over to you.
Thank you very much, and good evening, friends. I'm very grateful to be invited to speak to your Theological Society, and grateful to have been brought to Chelmsford for the first time in my life, particularly as I did get here an hour or so early, so I had a chance to visit your beautiful cathedral and to enjoy evensong with the, I'm not going to say the name of your Saint Rob, Saint School was singing very beautifully. So I've already enjoyed myself, and I hope you will find my talk interesting. Can I just check that everybody can hear me? Can you hear me at the back of the room? I've moved myself to one side so that you will be able to see some interesting images which I have brought you from the library of the Quakers, the Religious Society of Friends. We go back quite a long way, and we have a very fine library, so I thought I would make my talk more interesting by sharing with you some of the images from that library. But the first part of my talk is more in the nature of a formal introductory lecture. So, as you see, the title of my lecture, Quaker Peacework from Past to Present. I'm going to begin just by introducing myself in slightly greater detail, and then I would like to make some comments about Quakers' relationship with theology. I felt that as you are a theological society, that would be an appropriate way to introduce what I have to say about Quaker peacework. I'll then move on to a more specific discussion of Quaker peacework, and in the main part of my talk I will offer you an outline of historical and current Quaker peacework, which I hope will illustrate our Quaker faith in action, showing the link between our distinctive theology and our work in the world. So that's where we're going this evening. So, to introduce myself first, I'm a member, as you see, of Northampton local Quaker meeting and of the Religious Society of Friends, brackets, Quakers in Britain. That's the full title of our church. My mother was a Quaker, but it took me quite a long time to join her in membership of the Society of Friends. And like the majority of Quakers nowadays, I am what we call a convinced Quaker, rather than a birthright friend. I wasn't born into the Quaker Church. 100 years ago, it would have certainly been very much the other way around, in terms of the balance between born into the faith and people who become convinced. So, I came into membership only 7 years ago, after many years as a practicing and then a non-practicing Anglican, and an occasional attender at Quaker meetings with my mother. And also after a lifetime of strong commitment to moral and political values, which have always led me towards work for peace and social justice. I think I should mention here that I am speaking as an individual Quaker, which is one reason why I feel I need to introduce myself to you, rather than as a formal representative of our religious society. In my working life, I have been a teacher and a historian, teaching all ages from infants to pensioners, and in many different contexts. I've particularly enjoyed my voluntary work in adult education in association with quite a number of different organisations. But most of my paid employment has been as a university teacher and academic manager, and I've greatly enjoyed helping my hometown of Northampton to acquire its own university, which it achieved in 2005. In retirement, where I now am, I'm still studying and writing history, and currently I'm a part-time student of African history at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London. I'm also busy as a local Quaker and active in national Quaker committee work, including membership of Meeting for Sufferings, which is the name of our national council. Ask me why later if you are surprised by that name. And I'm a member of the Central Committee of Quaker Peace and Social Witness, which is the committee overseeing Quakers' national and international work for peace and social justice. So, this is who I am. Plainly, and I think I should mention this, who I am not. I am not a theologian. I hope you won't be too disappointed. I am not a minister or a priest or a clergyman. So I am going to offer you something different from the other lectures in this series. As you will know, the Quakers in Britain do not have a priesthood, in fact. And our religious society developed during the 17th century in fierce opposition to the priesthood of their day. The early Quakers claimed the priority of their own direct communication with God, in their own time, in their own place, and requiring no mediators. Our society nowadays has an administrative leadership at both local and national levels, and we also appoint elders to provide spiritual oversight and leadership in our meetings. But we still worship together as equals, without hierarchy and without a formal liturgy. This is the British tradition of Quakerism. However, it is important to understand that Quakerism has developed very differently in different parts of the world. British Quaker meetings are almost always what we call unprogrammed, while the worship of the majority of Quakers elsewhere in the world takes more programmed forms, closer to those of more traditional Christian churches. Here in Britain, we simply gather in silence and sit together, waiting and listening for God's presence to manifest itself in our midst. Our Quaker meetings are therefore unpredictable, sometimes wonderful, sometimes less wonderful. What I have to say about Quaker theology relates closely to what I've just said about Quaker worship. There is, and always has been, a huge volume of Quaker writings and publications. Quakers are meticulous record keepers and enthusiastic keepers of spiritual journals. We are active in many good causes, and we write about what we do in order to win practical support for our work. We also debate amongst ourselves, creating a mountain of Quaker pamphlets and magazines. Yet it is a significant fact that Quakerism has produced relatively few theologians. George Fox, the most influential founding father, was a preacher and a journal writer, not a theologian. William Penn, founder of Pennsylvania, was a preacher, a politician, and a social reformer. Robert Barclay, a second-generation Scottish Quaker and close friend of Penn, wrote an exposition of Quaker faith, generally known as Barclay's Apology, in 1676. And this book has been described by Ben Pig Dandelion, who is one of the most influential current writers on Quakerism. It's been described as, quote, the first and one of the last systematic Quaker theologies. And that was in 1676, so you see what I mean about not that many. In the early 20th century, reforming Quakers founded an annual lecture series called the Swarthmore Lectures, with a twofold purpose, and I quote, to interpret further to the members of the Society of Friends their message and mission, and secondly, to bring before the public the spirit, the aims, and fundamental principles of Friends. These inspiring lectures have made a major contribution to Quaker thinking and Quaker action during the last century, yet only a very small number of them contain substantial commentary upon Quaker beliefs in relation to the Bible and the basic tenets of Christianity. So what is the reason for this strange gap in Quaker literature? One rather worrying reason is suggested by Janet Scott, the Swarthmore lecturer of 1980, whose lecture was an exception to the rule. Under the challenging title, What Canst Thou Say? Towards a Quaker Theology, Janet invited friends to rethink their beliefs, with the wry comment that, quote, one might surmise that it has only been our reluctance to engage in theology that has prevented us from tearing ourselves apart. So, do Quakers shrink from theological debate because they are fearful of its divisive consequences within a society which is becoming ever more diverse, both in Britain and worldwide? There are certainly some within our society who fear that Quaker diversity has gone too far, and who struggle to accommodate our embrace of Quaker humanists and Quaker non-theists, alongside such hyphenated identities as Quaker Anglicans, Quaker Jews, and Quaker Buddhists. Yet the questions within Janet Scott's title, What Canst Thou Say?, was also famously asked by George Fox as a challenge to those who shrink from seeking out a religious faith which is intensely real and personal, rather than reliant upon familiar texts and rituals. This year's Quaker Yearly Meeting will take as its theme what it means to be a Quaker today, completing a 3-year exploration of our faith and practice, which was partly prompted by a sense of the need to consider what holds us together in an era of change. We have spent little time on doctrinal debate during this 3-year process, because Quakers have always respected the diversity of individual religious experience, and we continue to reject the idea of a fixed creed or catechism. However, we are sharing our experience of worship and of being guided by the Spirit when we make our decisions. This year, we will be talking about commitment and belonging, and the task of creating Quaker unity from religious diversity will undoubtedly come to the fore. I think that Quaker reluctance to embrace systematic theology is not only about our fear of dispute and division within our diverse society of friends. There are two other equally important reasons. The first of which is rooted in the nature of our Quaker worship. Early Quakers believed that the essence of worship lies in opening up our souls to receive God, or the inward light. This can be achieved through silent waiting with others following the same path towards openness. Words of spoken ministry may come from the silence, but only as an expression of a deep and direct experience of God within us. This profound emphasis upon silence and the interiority of our worship has probably tended to devalue some other kinds of religious communication, including theological analysis of religious faith. Whilst many Victorian Quakers were strongly influenced by the evangelical tradition and therefore more open to Bible-based worship and religious debate, the liberal Quakerism, which has predominated in Britain since the beginning of the 20th century, has re-emphasised the primacy of silence in enabling our spiritual search for a direct and personal connection with God. Our Quaker faith rests upon intuition and experience rather than upon intellectual discussion. So the many enthusiastic Quaker writers have turned their talents towards other kinds of writing. They have written extensively about their own lives and those of Quaker predecessors, often with the purpose of exemplifying religious experience in action rather than explaining its nature and origins. There has always been a strong emphasis within Quakerism on living out our faith in the world. The early Quakers were marked out by what they did as well as by what they said, whether it was refusing to doff a hat or take an oath, or refusing to pay tithes and fight in wars. I think that the third major reason why there is such a limited amount of published Quaker theology is simply that so many Quakers have attached more importance to doing rather than to saying their religious beliefs. So turning now to Quaker peace work, I would like to draw your attention to the many books explaining what Quakers have done and offering at least some explanation of why they've done it. There is a bibliography here, incidentally, for those of you who are interested in reading, to save me giving all the detail of the books. If you're interested, please help yourself. And all the literature on this table is just a small sample of free Quaker peace literature, so please help yourselves. So, many books explaining what Quakers have done. The first tracts defending Quaker pacifism appeared in the aftermath of the English Civil War, and we'll have more to say about them in a moment. These rather defensive documents were followed by Barclay's Apology, which I've mentioned, which set out an uncompromising peace testimony rooted in Bible scholarship. I will give you a flavour of this with a quotation from a modern English version of the Apology. Quote, "The words themselves are so clear that I find no need to illustrate or explain them. It is easier to reconcile the greatest of contradictions than it is to reconcile these laws of our Lord Jesus Christ with the wicked practice of war. They are plainly inconsistent. Who can reconcile, do not resist one who is evil, Matthew 5:39, with the injunction that evil must be resisted by force? Whoever has found a way to reconcile these things must also have found a way to reconcile God with the devil, Christ with Antichrist, light with darkness, and good with evil. If this is impossible, as indeed it is also impossible to reconcile war and revenge with Christian practice. Men only deceive themselves and others when they try unreservedly to do such an absurd and impossible thing." So strong stuff. The 18th century writings of the American Quaker John Woolman are equally vehement about the religious basis of pacifism, though from a much more personal and experiential viewpoint. I would like to recommend to you John Woolman's journal and major essays as one of the best explanations of how the Quaker peace commitment is interwoven with all our other 21st century Quaker testimonies to equality, to simplicity, to integrity, and to sustainability. For Woolman, there was only one Quaker social testimony, and peace and equality were at its heart. I could easily spend the rest of my time talking to you about other Quaker peace writings, but I would rather follow Woolman's example of showing how faith can usually best be developed and expressed through action. So there's the bibliography if you want more reading. All of those books, I would say, are written on the basis of extensive practical experience as well as intensive study. While some discuss international peace-building diplomacy, others consider prayerful resistance to war. Some take a very wide view of peacemaking, including Quaker efforts to resolve interpersonal and social conflicts, rather than simply the issues of peace and war. For a recent overview of Quaker religious thinking about peace, I would recommend David G's short book, Holding Faith. Holding Faith, Creating Peace in a Violent World, 2011, produced to mark the 350th anniversary of the first published Quaker peace testimony. I also recommend John Lampon's even shorter pamphlet, Love Growing in Us, Questioning the Quaker Peace Testimony. That was published in 2012. So, on we go with what is basically a historical survey of Quaker peace work from past to present. I've given you some introduction, talked a bit about Quakers and theology, and now to address the core of what I have to say to you, which is about Quaker peace work, faith into practice, and how that has developed over time, and this is where the illustrations start. I am going to talk about present-day peace work, both central peace work, which is being done by the Quakers, and also some of the work being done within my own local meeting. And really, this isn't a history lesson, this is about illustrating the way in which we try to put our religious faith into practice through our peace work. So let's go back to the beginning, back to 1661 or 1660, depending on which version of the calendar you're using. Here we have a pamphlet from George Fox and 11 others addressed to King Charles II, disassociating themselves from a recent rebellion by the Fifth Monarchists and stating the religious basis of their opposition to all armed conflict. It has been said this is a very self-defensive pamphlet, and it's mostly about Quakers saving their own skins. There were 4,000 Quakers imprisoned at the time, and there was a definite threat to life and limb for members of the Religious Society of Friends. But I think it can be read nowadays very profitably as a statement of collective faith. It is supported by extensive biblical references, including starting from the commandment, "Thou shalt not kill." And it concludes as follows, quote, "The Spirit of Christ, which leads us into all truth, will never move us to fight and war against any man with outward weapons, neither for the kingdom of Christ, nor for the kingdoms of this world." And I think we should note that this is actually only one of quite a number of such pamphlets produced in the 1660s. My own favourite was produced by Margaret Fell, who later married George Fox, became Mrs. George Fox. She wrote to the king asking him to release Quaker prisoners. And in her appeal to the king, she made up what I think is the first really strong case for Quaker peace work, rather than simply a refusal to fight. So it's not just anti-war, it's positively for peace. And she finishes up, quote, "We are a people that follow after those things that make for peace, love and unity. It is our desire that others' feet may walk in the same, and we do deny and bear our testimony against all strife and wars." So positive peacemaking, that's very much what Quakerism is about. My next image, calmer times. We're in the 18th century now. I've chosen this particular one to illustrate what is sometimes called the quietist period in Quaker history. In the 18th century, the immediate emergencies of the Restoration, the Civil War and so forth were over. Quakers were focused very much on developing their meetings from within, but they did remain true to their peace testimony. And two of the most famous 18th century Quakers made their peaceful mark upon American history and were also influential in Britain. Not very pleased with the quality of this image, but it reproduces a painting of William Penn, there he is, talking with the, what now is called the Native Americans, the Indians. It was actually commissioned, this painting, by William Penn's son, and then reproduced as an engraving, could be cheaply reproduced. So it was actually found in Quaker meetings up and down the country, particularly in the 18th century. William Penn, as you probably know, settled Pennsylvania in the 1680s, and he began what he called the holy experiment of governing without an army and talking and trading rather than fighting with the Indian neighbours or the occupants of the country. So it was an illustration of Quaker peacemaking in action, if you like, the positive side of Quaker peacemaking. Our next Quaker hero, we don't really do heroes because we believe in equality, but anyway, this one is really my all-time favourite Quaker, John Woolman. As I've already said, his journal is really one of my favourite books. He became best known as an opponent of slavery. He was another American another American Quaker. He understood slavery, he explained it as a form of economic violence and a denial of human equality. It was a profoundly religious and a profoundly peaceful opposition to slavery, in other words. He brought his anti-slavery message to Britain, and in fact he died while touring England, sharing his anti-slavery ministry with British Quakers. That was in 1772. In 1783, the Religious Society of Friends made its first corporate condemnation of the slave trade. And Quakers were, as you probably know, at the forefront of the British abolition campaign for the next 50 years. Not only Quakers, many good Anglicans as well, and members of other churches, but Quakers did have a very prominent role in that campaign. Moving on into the 19th century, I rather like this image. This is the first one actually from the archives of the Religious Society of Friends. It shows you the first Quaker war relief workers. Dates from 1870, so we've leapt on 100 years. And these are Quakers who went to relieve civilian suffering and military, if they had the opportunity, during the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. During the 19th century, before we get as far as 1870, of course, Quakers had been strongly influenced by evangelicalism, as I've mentioned, and they became very active in many social reform movements, as well as maintaining their own opposition to military expenditure and war, where they didn't have so many allies. Quaker opposition to capital punishment and support for prison reform, notably through Elizabeth Fry, should be understood as part of the Quaker peace testimony. So was the Quaker commitment to alleviating the impact of war on everyone involved, whether friends or enemies, whether soldiers or civilians. And this is what led to the War Victims Relief Service of 1870. Moving on rapidly through history to the First World War. The First World War posed the biggest challenge yet to Quaker pacifism, leading to very varied Quaker responses. Not all Quakers were or are pacifists, however we define that, something we might want to discuss. Some Quakers volunteered to serve in the army or navy. Some were conscripted. Many registered as conscientious objectors from 1916 onwards. And of these, some refused all civilian work, even indirectly connected with the war effort, and ended up in prison. There was no one Quaker opposition to the war in 1914. What there was a great deal of soul-searching and praying and considering how the Quaker peace testimony was to be interpreted in the circumstances of the First World War. So here are some of the Quaker volunteers of 1914, men and women, following in the footsteps of the war victims relief workers of 1870. Notice they're all wearing the star on their shoulder, which was a direct continuity. Can we see still wearing the star in 1870? So that they will be recognised as Quaker relief workers. Probably the best known Quaker peace workers of the First World War are these chaps in the middle here. The Friends Ambulance Unit. The Friends Ambulance Unit was founded in 1914. I believe they're in Belgium. Nobody has absolutely pinned down this picture. I rather like the image of the unarmed Quakers with their little stars on their shoulders, surrounded by men with really large guns, who I think are members of the Belgian army. We have any military historians who could absolutely nail down where that image is. I think the Religious Society of Friends Library would be grateful, as they weren't able to tell me where that is. But anyway, it shows the Friends Ambulance Unit in its very early days in action during the First World War. During the Second World War, the FAU, the Friends Ambulance Unit, further developed. And we see here the trundling through the streets of Bloomsbury, and you can see a well-supported, well-financed, large-scale operation, working not just in Europe, but as far afield as China, in fact, involving many hundreds, providing opportunity for many hundreds of conscientious objectors who were not necessarily Quakers to involve themselves in war service, non-violent war service, organised and largely financed by the Quakers. As with the First World War, Quakers had made very difficult choices about what work to actually become involved in if they didn't want to fight. Many joined the Quaker Relief Service in preference to joining the Friends Ambulance Unit. Sometimes there wasn't room for them all in the Friends Ambulance Unit, but it was also a matter of choice. There are members of my Northamptonshire area meeting still alive, to elderly friends in the 90s, one from the Friends Ambulance Unit and one's from the Friends Relief Service. It's been a wonderful education for me to talk to both these men and in fact to record something of their memories, how differently they perceived their service, how differently they felt also about the setting up of a Quaker service memorial in the National Arboretum in Staffordshire, which some of you will know about. It's largely military memorials, but there are an increasing number actually of civilian memorials to war service of alternative types. Our friend from the Quaker Relief Service was not at all keen on having a memorial in such a military setting, whereas our friend from the Friends Ambulance Unit, much more open to. I have to say they've both come round to it now, they've both been there and both support it now. But I think it illustrates some of the dilemmas of opposing war in the context of the Second World War. Women as well as men were involved in Friends Relief Service work. Notably, a lot of male and female Quakers served in the former combatant countries immediately after the war, providing food and other kinds of support. I think this friend here, she's got a star again on her shoulder. I think she's holding what we would call a Quaker grace, just a moment of silence before the children eat. The outcome of all this Quaker work was, for Quakers, a very surprising degree of public recognition. They were used to being kind of vilified for their pacifist stand in the First World War. At the end of the Second World War, they were actually, in 1947, awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, along with the American Friends Service Committee, which was jointly awarded for the peaceful service which Quakers had given during the Second World War. I'm going to skip on through the 20th century, showing you roughly one image from each decade and trying to make one quick point about each decade as we skip towards the 21st century. Well, one image from two decades. After the war, 1950s, 1960s, of course, we have the onset of the Cold War and of Quaker efforts to defuse tension through support for the United Nations and also through friendly contacts with the Soviet Union and Cuba, as well as through opposition to nuclear weapons. And this image shows one of the early Ban the Bomb demonstrations. The old Marston marches started in 1958 were strongly supported by many Quakers from 1958 onwards. The 1970s, Quaker peace action took to the roads, and I think this is a particularly significant slogan. World peace will only come through action by ordinary people like yourselves. That was very much in tune with Quaker faith in each of us having responsibility for peace, rather than simply those who were at the United Nations or in government, or those who could perhaps afford to travel to talk with people in Moscow or whatever. The peace action caravan travelled all over the country promoting a very democratic vision of peacemaking as not just anti-war, but about building the sort of society in which peace would flourish. So, the responsibility of ordinary people, because peace was fundamentally an issue of conscience, not an issue of politics. This one from the 1980s shows you a whole number of posters, mostly from the campaign against the arms trade, which was mentioned when we were talking this evening. But now again, Quakers were not the only church who were involved with the campaign against the arms trade, but they did have an important role in getting it started. And I think the point I want to make here is that I think it's something I like about the Quaker peace work, that very often Quakers have gone in and helped to start things up, but not been possessive about them. Not everybody knows, for example, that Oxfam began as a subcommittee of Oxford Quaker meeting. That's one of the biggest examples, but the campaign against the arms trade also has a seed within quite small Quaker meetings, which developed into something which is still a very important organisation. It's about broadening the peace campaign, and I think these posters also illustrate quite well that Quakers are trying to address the roots of conflict in the sort of way that Margaret Fell would approve of. They're not only talking about peace and war, they're talking about feeding the hungry, they're talking about education, health. And again, world peace will only come through the will of ordinary people like yourself. So there's a continuity there with the Quaker message you saw on the previous image. Into the 1990s, we're in colour. And I think this one is another, as you can see, another anti-nuclear demonstration. The Quakers are there alongside many others. If I was showing this to a Quaker audience, I would say, well, there are one or two Quaker friends here tonight, I would say look out for your granny, or even look out for yourself if you're old enough. It's only 1990s, that wasn't that long ago. Not believable. Okay, so it's Trafalgar Square, and really the point I wanted to make here is that Quakers are working alongside people of many other faiths and no particular declared faith. They are also internationalising their peace work to a greater extent than ever before. I think that's characteristic of the more recent period. They're networking. Quakers have not only been quite important in sort of being the grit in the oyster and starting various important peace organisations, they have also quite unobtrusively provided resources and a sort of base, sometimes just a physical space, in fact, where peace workers can come together. The Friends House in London, opposite Euston Station, some of you probably know that enormous building. It's not all full of Quakers, it's far too big for our fairly small society. It is quite often full of groups of peace workers from many different organisations. And we invite them in and try to help other people's efforts. We don't think we have a monopoly on peacemaking, far from it. That would be a pretty poor outlook if we attempted anything of the sort. So, here we are in the 21st century now. And Quaker Peace and Social Witness is the organisation which I work with, and it brings together peace and social witness, very much in the spirit of peace is about having a world where the root causes of violence are being addressed, where faith is being put into action. And notice that we're still using that star which you saw back in 1870 as our symbol. It's got a dove on it now. QPSW have given me this slide to show you because they really would like you to know that our work is as much spirit-led as it was in the 1660s. Although we are working with all sorts of other groups, all kinds of secular groups, all kinds of other churches and so forth, it doesn't mean that our Quaker religious motivation is any less strong than it has been in previous centuries. And I want to just illustrate to you, this is rather a boring slide, this is our kind of strategic plan for the 5 years. We're just coming to the end of this one, writing another one. But I'd like you to draw your attention to the centrality of peace within the things which we are trying to do, but also notice right at the top, strengthening our spiritual roots. Without that, nothing as far as we're concerned as Quakers. So, what are we doing? The work of Quaker Peace and Social Witness. I'm going to give you just a glimpse of the central work of our society in the 21st century by mentioning, first of all, 2 of the British programmes. But let's just have an overview first. We have 15 current programmes, centrally funded and centrally managed programmes, work on peace and social justice. 22 staff with a £2 million budget and a committee and various subcommittees running all this work. So what are they all up to? One of our schemes is called the Quaker Peace Worker Scheme. The Quakers are funding young people to spend a year as paid interns in peace organisations. Not necessarily, in fact not usually, Quaker organisations. It could be the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, it could be the Campaign Against the Arms Trade. It could be an organisation which doesn't have very much Quaker presence at all, but it's something that we think is linked to the way that we see Quaker peace work. This young man is working for the Alternatives to Violence project, if any of you have come across that. Very much about peace within ourselves, about finding peaceful ways to live rather than campaigning against war. In contrast, Turning the Tide is another British programme of Quakers, which is about providing training in social activism, in non-violent protest and campaigning. And that, again, is provided to all sorts of organisations, many of them not Quaker. But it's the other side of the coin, the very, very personal to the outward-facing peace campaigning. So there's a very quick summary, in case your time was running short, which it always does, of some of the peace work that we're currently engaged in. Placements, Turning the Tide, the campaigning which you would expect and which you saw in the earlier slides. Our peace education work in schools is something which I'd love to have more time to talk about, but I'm going to have to skip lightly over, in order to go on and tell you a little bit about our international work which is going on currently. Our placement scheme, 1-year placements of young graduates usually, is also an international scheme. We send 2 people a year to work in Burundi with local peace organisations, fully funded, fully trained. It's a wonderful learning experience for them, it's good for their CVs, and many of them want to go on and work for NGOs and so forth. But it also does bring very useful skills and contacts and so forth to the peace organisations in Burundi. We have quite a large Quaker programme in East Africa, again, and I'd like to emphasise this, working with local organisations. Not necessarily feeling that we're in the lead, but feeling that we have something to feed in to work which is already going on. In this case, the local organisation is CAPI, Change Agents for Peace International, a Kenyan organisation. We are also working in Uganda and in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and in Burundi has been moved. This is an interesting one which some of you will know about from your own churches. The Ecumenical Accompanier Programme, which had a snappier title, we call it the EA Programme sometimes, in Palestine and in Israel. The programme is a programme of the World Council of Churches, as you may know, and most of the accompaniers are not Quakers again, but the programme in Britain is administered by the Quakers. The training is provided by the Quakers, and I'm very pleased that the other British churches, if you like, entrust that work to the Quakers. What do? They accompany, they literally walk alongside children going to school in the occupied territories. They stand alongside peaceful protesters whose houses are sometimes being demolished. They observe, they record what's happening at checkpoints. They are involved in a lot of human rights monitoring work. That's basically what they're doing. And we see that as being very much in tune with our Quaker peace testimony. Quakers are also active at the United Nations. We have Quaker offices both in New York and in Geneva. Quakers were given observer status when the United Nations was set up, and we're still there. I think, obviously, this is the image that I've been given by QPSW, the big chair. It's a bit ironical. Quaker peace work at the United Nations is quiet diplomacy. It's having off-the-record quiet meetings, providing a space for other people to meet, as we do at Friends' House. It's also about some fairly targeted research and kind of niche campaigning around issues which are particularly close to our Quaker hearts. This woman is Rachel Brett. She is the programme leader for the Human Rights and Refugees Quaker programme at the United Nations in Geneva. She's done very useful and important work in relation to child soldiers and the full implementation of conscientious objection legislation in various parts of the world. So we're working at the United Nations, and there's one final one from the United Nations. Seeds for Food is a programme around intellectual property rights in food planting. Difficult to say this briefly, but it's about how, if you like, a sort of capitalist control over the production and spread of seeds can cut against subsistence farmers' welfare and against sustainable agriculture in various ways. So that's just a little reference to the work that the Quakers at the United Nations do in relation to sustainability. And there's my summary. No time to talk about Southeast Asia. There's interesting work there as well. Any of these, if you're interested in the questions, I can tell you more about. I want to move on finally to say something about what's going on in my local meeting. You see, it could be the case that we are just raising money in Northamptonshire, where I come from, in order to do all these wonderful things at the United Nations and so on, but that wouldn't be very Quaker, because we think that our individual conscience is where our religious faith develops and grows, and therefore we have an individual responsibility to put our faith into practice, and not just by putting money in. So you will find up and down the country that Quaker meetings are involved to a greater or lesser extent in very varied ways in their own peace work. And some of the big programmes which are now funded millions of pounds going into the Friends' House are actually programmes that started at local level. Sometimes we take from national level or international level and we reflect that in the work we choose to do locally, but we do all make our own minds up. We're a very democratic organisation. And this is one thing we've done. This man, Len Gray, is a member of my Quaker meeting. He is the friend from the Friends Relief Service, and there he is conscientiously objecting. He was doing forestry work at that stage in 1941. We produced a book of stories of our Quaker peace work locally. We produced our own exhibition. The son, this is Ernest Barder. His son, Godric Barder, is the friend from the Friends ambulance unit who I was referring to before. And here they are out on the streets of London in 1959. And dear Godric had actually kept this banner for 50 years in his garage, so that when we had a Quaker Peace exhibition in Northampton, he was able to produce not just the photograph, but the actual banner. And after the exhibition, we actually took the banner to the Bradford Peace Museum, set up by Quakers as a National Peace Museum. Something different. This friend here, Alex Kiabi, is an attender at our local meetings. He's a Ugandan Quaker. He works locally, he lives in Northampton, but he raises money from a relatively small salary to fund this project in his home village in Uganda, which is a project training young people to make furniture. So it's a training project for unemployed young people. So we're supporting that project. We're also trying to persuade QPSW to give a larger grant to this very good project. And we're learning a lot about Uganda in the process. Here we are out doing the traditional thing. This is our version of the Aldermaston marches. Out protesting against the International Arms Fair outside Parliament. And there's our lovely Quaker meeting house. built nice and big in 1831 so that you could fit 600 people in it, according to the local newspaper, for an anti-slavery meeting. And there's our little Quaker burial ground in front of it. Anyway, the reason for including this is to make the point that we're trying to green our meeting house. That is part of our religious witness at the moment. Sustainability for us is about reducing our carbon footprint, which is something which the Society of Friends generally is strongly committed to at the moment. Finally, sorry, apologies for photos of myself, I just wanted to mention our Palestine Friendship Association, again set up by Quakers in my hometown. Two of us went with Quaker Voluntary Action to the West Bank 2 or 3 years ago. We met with the mayor of this town, we gave him a plate from Northampton Museum, and he asked us to do a town twinning. And that's what Quakers are leading in Northampton as well at the moment. It's had all sorts of interesting consequences. We've had visitors from the West Bank. This is one of our friends, John Rawlings, former mayor of Northampton, running up the steps to the Guildhall to give them a tour of the Guildhall. These were our very first Palestinian visitors to Northampton. Armour lives in a refugee camp in Nablus. He was very taken with the local canals. He said he would like to live on a canal, but I think he would like it in the winter is another question. And there we are a couple of weeks ago. We've just had a group of 15 women from the West Bank staying with us. And here's the embroidered in traditional Palestinian embroidery, the symbol of our friendship with the town of Alberia. The three, 1, 2, 3 are Quakers. These two are our Palestinian visitors. And this is a friendship link which I hope will run and run. There are our visitors enjoying the countryside, meeting the locals, and having some very serious political conversations in our meeting house. So there's our local Quaker meeting work. And of course this is very much on our minds at the moment. World War I commemoration, peace, education. I'm going to finish by making again the point, underlining again the point that our work is part of our worship. But I wanted to finish with these two quotations, which are 300 years apart, but I think do illustrate the continuities in our peace work, the religious continuities. First of all, William Penn, the founder of Pennsylvania in 1682. True godliness don't turn men out of the world, but enables them to live better in it and excites their endeavours to mend it. I think nobody's ever said that better, actually. It's about, for us, for me, it's about Quaker peace work, putting faith into action. The other one from 1993, our London yearly meeting, our annual gathering. The peace testimony today is seen in what we do, severally and together with our lives. We pray for the involvement of the Spirit with us, that we may work for a more just world. I like that one because once again it links working for peace to working for social justice. The creation of a more just world, removing the causes of war, is about fundamentally what Quaker peace work is about. So I hope I have succeeded in introducing you to this key aspect of Quakerism, which is Quaker peace work. It is shared by Quakers worldwide. It is prominent, as I've said, within every Quaker meeting at local level. I've been trying to illustrate the historical consistency of our Quaker peace testimony, while at the same time showing its evolution in response to changing social and political circumstances. But I think most importantly, I hope I have conveyed to you our belief that peace is a religious calling. However we interpret it, the peace testimony remains a defining part of our Quaker faith, as well as an enduring element of our Quaker witness to the world. Leave you with a peaceful image for you to make your own minds up, friends.